speaker by characterizing villains of history as monsters. You characterize them as people who are so far removed from reality they are crude caricatures of a very complex picture they really are. An oversimplistic view is a view that causes alienation from reality, and that's what we have a problem with on the affirmative side of this house. So, what would we do instead? We think it's most important to focus on the causal factors that led to the rise of these villains, rather than to characterize them simplistically as monsters. We think we'd do things like characterize the effects of colonialism on conflict states in Africa more effectively. We'd do things like analyze the fact that the Treaty of Versailles and the impoverishment of the people of Germany had a great impact on the rise of Hitler. We think it's incredibly difficult to paint that complex picture when you are simply saying those villains themselves are monsters. We would institute this type of thing in state curricula and also in museums. To be very clear though, Mr. Speaker, on the affirmative side of this house, we are rather uncontroversially convinced that Hitler was a terrible human. However, we think it's incredibly important that he was a human who did terrible things, rather than a monster who did terrible things. And it's through viewing them as humanity, understanding why their humanity is corrupted, that we think we get the best picture of history, and the picture of history is most important for the people who suffered from those villains. It's on that I have 2 points of substantive material. Firstly, why we can't present a monodimensional view of history, and secondly, how this policy would in fact aid in the ability for future recovery in states and from conflicts. So firstly, on a monodimensional view of history, we think crude caricatures of these villains is mutually exclusive with a nuanced understanding of them. We think this encourages people to look no further than those crude caricatures, because they're often presented incredibly powerfully, and it's often very difficult for people to have the motivation to go into a nuanced researched understanding of that particular person when all they're presented with was the entirely convinced view that person was a monster. You can't explain the reasons why that person was truly awful when you put them in a category that is something that is unexplainable. We think it's incredibly important that you have the ability to get the type of nuanced understanding. We think this results in 2 things. Firstly, taking a simplistic view of history is mutually exclusive from learning from those past mistakes. If we look at the example of the rise of neo-Nazi parties in Greece, we think the coverage of that has been relatively limited, when in fact, what we think is impoverishment was often the main cause as to why people turned to those neo-Nazi parties. It's incredibly important that that type of commentary is made front and centre, rather than the commentary which we got, which was comparing those neo-Nazi parties to monsters. We obviously think that the views held by those neo-Nazi parties are reprehensible. However, the best way we can learn from those mistakes is to ensure that the commentary we get surrounding the rise of those parties is commentary based on the impoverishment of the Greek people that led to them voting for those neo-Nazi parties. But also, we think it's incredibly important that we focus on the psychological disposition of humans. We think recent evidence has suggested that Hitler may have had psychological issues during his term and his rise to power. We think we can't get that type of analytical framework when we use a framework which is based on someone being a monster rather than based on someone being a human. We think it's unexplainable, someone being a monster, because it's not something that's a reality to people. Whereas someone's humanity and the adjudication of whether or not that humanity was right or wrong is something that is understandable to people. But the second thing we think this results in is it homogenises the groups that were involved and were supporters of that particular person. When you don't understand the reasons why the Nazi Party took to power, it's very easy to conflate all Germans' support for Hitler as being all Germans being monsters, rather than the fact that, as I alluded to before, we think the Treaty of Versailles and the treatment of the Western powers of the German people was often a very significant contribution to Hitler's rise. We think it is reprehensible to say that all people who supported a villainous person should be lumped into the group of those who are monsters. We think it's incredibly important that we understand the reasons why people supported that dictator. We think, lastly, Mr. Speaker, history should reflect the truth, and I think the best way we can reflect the truth is through a nuanced understanding of the actual things that occur, rather than a crude caricature of a monster. That brings me now to the second point of substantive, about how this policy, in fact, aids the ability for us to get a future recovery in many of these states. That's for 3 reasons. Firstly, we think a lack of acknowledgement of someone's own role in these types of conflicts leads to problematic outcomes for state relations and reconciliation. We think states are less likely to actively seek reconciliation with other states or admit to those wrongs when the faults that they have committed themselves are not front and centre. So for example, there's often a prominent view of developed nations that poverty is the fault of developing nations. They did not do enough to improve their economy, and they're not doing enough with the amount of aid that's being given them. We look no further than the recent British election and the rise of UKIP to say that that's probably something that is not particularly controversial to assert in this debate. We think in reality though, colonialism and the impact of developed nations had certainly something to do with the type of impoverishment that is now faced by developing nations. We think those developed nations, like Britain, who are responsible for that colonialism, are less likely to seek out that reconciliation with those states, when all they need to do is present a very crude picture of history, and a very crude picture of history that casts certain other types of actors in that debate as villains. But we also think it hampers the ability of states to engage with other states. So for instance, we think it hampers the ability of the developed world to engage properly with states like North Korea, when Kim Jong-un is simply painted by the media and presented to the people as being a monster. In reality, we think there are many reasons why Kim Jong-un is probably acting the way he is. The fact that he needs to uphold the legacy of his father, the fact that he's often facing certain militaristic pressures within his party to commit the types of things that he is doing. We think it's very difficult to have that type of engagement between states when all that's being presented to the people who are pressuring those states to engage is in fact a picture of a monster. But the second thing we say in terms of aiding future recovery is when this policy is implemented, it will be easier to convince supporters of those figures that their views are incorrect. When neo-Nazi groups and supporters of Mussolini are presented with caricatures, they're less likely to believe the truth. That's because further investigation into those leaders quite obviously reveals a more nuanced picture. And when that picture isn't presented to them in the first instance, they're less likely to believe the types of information that they're being told. They're less likely to trust that curriculum, and less likely to try and believe those things and those facts, when in fact all they're presented with in the first instance is the caricature. We think that's incredibly harmful, because we think one of the most important things in this debate is in fact ensuring that those types of leaders never rise again. And the best way to do that is to convince their supporters by providing the facts of those genocides, those atrocities that are committed by those horrible people, rather than placating certain interests by simply providing these crude depictions. But the third thing we say in this point about future recovery is this is better for the victims and the families of victims who are survivors or have relatives who were survivors of these atrocities. We think what victims want in the vast majority of instances is the truth. That's especially true in light of the fact that the truth has been concealed from them for many years, like the fact that Jews in the concentration camps didn't know the true horrors of the Nazi regime. We think understanding is the best thing for catharsis. And we think by providing these depictions, it's very difficult for victims to attach their feelings to those caricatures. They're so far removed from reality that it's very difficult to believe that condemnation that it's attached to them is in fact real. We think the understanding we give victims through a picture of history that is far more nuanced is a picture of history that we're more willing to support. So, Mr. Speaker, not only do we think it's important that history reflects truth, and that truth necessarily means a non-monodimensional understanding of these villains, we also think this policy is better for the future recovery for the people who are harmed by these atrocities, and that's why this motion should stand.
I think the first affirmative for the speech. Now I'd like to welcome the first negative, James, whose preferred pronoun is he or they. Here.
You walk around the killing fields in Cambodia, Mr. Speaker, you see the trees where infants were bashed to death. You see the pits where women and children were herded into and systemically massacred. And it's hard for us to convey the moral weight of the suffering that occurred in such places. Hard for us to explain things like the Holocaust. Language bridges that gap. And it's only when we condemn people who ordered those atrocities in the strongest terms possible do we do justice to the victims, but also do we push those ideologies as furthest away as we can from the mainstream and mainstream discussion. So there'll be three substantive points from this side of the House. I'm firstly going to outline why this policy does betray victims in representing their experiences. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why the term monster specifically constructs necessary ideological barriers to those ideologies and everything that they represent. At second, James is going to tell you about why this helps to prevent future atrocities. I firstly want to look at some rebuttal. The first argument that you were told is that in using the word monster, you prevent focus on things like the causal factors that led to certain events happening. Let's be clear. You can still elucidate causal factors that led to a monster emerging. So for instance, you can still say the Treaty of Versailles and the economic suffering that Germany suffered in World War I led to popular support for Hitler, at the same time as saying that the Holocaust was a monstrous act and Hitler is a monster as a result. And if you actually just run a basic plausibility test on what they are saying, we have lots and lots of research and lots of mainstream knowledge about why certain monsters emerge. We have those discussions occurring. It's not true that the term monster monopolizes those discussions and prevents those discussions. Because there's a large amount of research into, for instance, why Golden Dawn is emerging in Greece. We all know about it in this room, so it's not necessarily true that we can't simply engage in further research or actually look beyond certain terms. So we do get those discussions. What else did they tell you? They talked about colonialism and reconciliation, how it's easier when you actually create space for discussion. We think it's easier to demand reconciliation and, for instance, remuneration from richer countries at the point where they think that a past leader in their country did something monstrous. Because at the point where you accentuate the moral weight of what a certain country did, it's far more likely that you get political support in that country to actually apologise for those actions. At the point where you open that discussion to say, maybe colonialism did have some good aspects, that's when people are less likely to support things like remuneration, because they think they actually did have some legitimate claim to those actions. The final argument he gave you is that students who are learning, for instance, in class will see that something is incongruous with their reality and they'll start to question it. Again, students aren't simply going to only focus on the word monster. And it's perfectly possible, and indeed students do, they can understand that, for instance, there were certain economic conditions that led to the German people or the Russian people supporting Stalin or Hitler, but also at the same time realizing that the actions that those leaders engaged in were monstrous. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to think those people had some virtue, because they can see that 6 million people essentially being burned to death is a monstrous act, and they can also realize that there were reasons as to why the people supported that leader in the first place. I now want to move on to my substantive case. Firstly, why this policy is a betrayal to the victims, which has so far been ignored in this debate. Language is one of the most important tools that we have in shaping the way that we experience the world. And there are certain moral events that occur throughout the world that we struggle to place words for. Because when you say 6 million people died in the Holocaust, it's hard to use language to actually convey the suffering that occurred, to convey the moral weight of that depravity. Same thing goes for things like Stalin's gulags, for the actions of Pol Pot, as I alluded to in my introduction. What is the consequence of that? To not use condemnation in the strongest way possible is to do a profound disservice to those victims. Because importantly, to the Jewish people, for instance, there is absolutely no doubt as to the fact that Hitler was a monster, because that's a moral truth for them. They were the ones that had their ancestors slaughtered in those death camps. At the point where you leave that discussion open and you don't get the strongest condemnation, you not only deny a fundamental moral truth to the victims, but you also say that their suffering isn't the most important consideration. That maybe Hitler had good economic policy and that should be a consideration. We think that when the victims were the ones that suffered those horrible atrocities, their interests should be considered first, but also given that lots of these atrocities were identity-based, we should also keep in mind that identity is an important consideration and shouldn't prioritise the interests of, for instance, white people who want to have a broader discussion over the narrower interests but nonetheless more important interests of those victims. Moreover, we think that a refusal to condemn those events in the strongest terms possible means that words seep into the public consciousness and further re-victimize people. So for instance, lots of people make jokes about Jewish people and about Jews to this day, and those people are further re-victimized through things like Holocaust jokes because people don't seem to think that that's as awful as it was. It's only when we use terms like monster in association with Hitler, who actually conducted that event, do we stop those words and stop those actions and stop those jokes seeping into the public consciousness, which further re-victimize people who don't need to be re-victimized. Second then, why does this construct necessary ideological barriers to those movements? Because unfortunately, as has been acknowledged in this debate, there are fringe radical movements in places like Europe, for instance. You have strong neo-Nazi followings in countries like Bulgaria, countries like Romania, countries like Greece. We think those are an important reality that we need to acknowledge. Why does using the word monster stop those people joining, and why does it also decrease support for those movements? Using the word monster increases the social cost for people who want to associate with those types of ideologies. Because at the point where you leave that discussion open, it's more likely that people are going to join those movements. Because they can say, perhaps it's true that Hitler did have good economic policy. Perhaps that's something that we should place value on. Perhaps there's a reason as to why I should join this movement. At the point where the initial cognitive association is with the word monster, they are far less likely to join those movements because it's been imbued in their social consciousness, it's been imbued in their essence, and they're less likely instinctively to join those movements. But the second part of this is more important, is that it helps to actually stem the rise of mainstream support for parties like Golden Dawn, which are overtly racist and which do propose oppressive policies. So if we think a little bit about Golden Dawn in Greece, it's much easier for them to get mainstream support at the point where the public doesn't think that the actions that they are associated with or the policies that they support are monstrous. Because if you think about it, it's as per the social cost analysis that I just gave you. If you open the discussion up, people are far more likely to say, well, maybe so-and-so did do this aspect right. Maybe there was merit in the certain idea that he was proposing. That's when you get mainstream support, because people don't focus on the fact that they were associated with monstrous figures in history. We think constructing that monstrous cognitive association deters people from supporting mainstream parties, because at the point where you associate a party with Golden Dawn, with Hitler or Stalin, for instance, it's far less likely instinctively that people would ever vote for such a party, even in times of severe economic distress. We think that is a decision that people ought to make. And that reflects on the final part of this point, is that at the point where you don't use the word monster or a similarly strong term, you make the debates about what those people did a kind of weighing game. Because then you get discourse as people saying, well, he may have caused the death of 100,000 people, but he also led to economic development. So Mao in China is a good example of that. There are lots of communists who still say Mao's evils were necessary because it led to China being on the path of economic development. We don't think that's a discussion that we should have when there were people who were systematically slaughtered in China. It's not only a disservice to them, but it also means that those ideas are more palatable in the current day, and it means that parties that propose those types of policies, who run on that type of basis, are more likely to get mainstream support. But let's remember, these people were absolutely evil. The idea that there was something good about them, that there was something redeeming about them, is a fiction, and it's only a fiction that people who weren't associated with those events, that weren't victimized with their events, could ever understand. We think victims are the most important consideration in this debate, and there's no room for discussion about that.
I think the first negative for the speech. I'd like to welcome the second speaker of the affirmative, Nick, whose preferred pronoun is he or they. Here.
Well, Mr. Speaker, James's introduction was very moving. He described in some depth the horrors committed by Pol Pot's regime. But you notice that he didn't need to use the word monster, because he wasn't describing Pol Pot. He was describing the actions that were done and condemning those using the strongest possible language. We didn't think that that meant that you shouldn't call Pol Pot a monster, because that meant you lost the humanity, or the worst form of humanity, that led to Pol Pot committing those particular atrocities. We needed to view these people through the lens of their humanity, such that we could understand the wrongs that they had committed and what had caused them to commit those wrongs, such that we can prevent people from doing the same thing in the future. You don't lose the capacity to make that strong condemnation when you do, as James demonstrated so kindly for us. 3 points in this speech. Firstly, why complex and nuanced pictures of history are important and why the word monster crowds that out. Secondly, what the practical effects of using the word monster going into the future. Substantively, I'm going to explain why that word causes nationalistic narratives which prevents current reconciliation. On the first of these questions, why complex and nuanced pictures are important. We heard that we needed the strongest possible condemnation of these people. As I said in my introduction, we would support the strongest possible condemnation of their actions, because their actions were no doubt abhorrent. But when you used the word monster, you described someone as something that was otherworldly, that was impossible to understand what humanity had caused them to do in that respect. We think that that's really bad, because it means people don't understand the complexity that was behind that. They said that they could have both, but we didn't think that was true. Because when you use the word monster, people didn't feel the need to look any further. They didn't feel the need to explore the complexity because they'd been told a very simple narrative that they were able to grasp. That was the very thing that the negative team liked about the word monster, because it was a simple condemnation. But the problem with using that language is you didn't understand what was behind that. Mao was perhaps a really good example of that, Mr. Speaker, because it was true that some of the things Mao did were abhorrent, but it was also true that some people in China felt that what Mao did was particularly important, and they don't deserve to be simply excluded from the discourse using really straightforward language. We were able to present a more complex picture, which was that Mao did some terrible things and some good things. That was something in which all parties should engage. If we want to reconcile from something in which certain parties were disenfranchised or excluded, it was better to ensure that every single person could engage and no one person was marginalised. And that goes to some of Tom's substantive that wasn't properly responded to by the first negative speaker. What Tom told you is that when you characterise someone as a monster, you subsume other people into that identity. Every single person who supported the Nazi Party becomes a person who also loses their humanity because they were willing to support this person who was so otherworldly, so monstrous that we could not understand what was behind them. And that was an unfair burden to put upon those people, and it was an unfair burden to put upon Germans as a whole because their opposition to Hitler, where it existed, wasn't represented to a substantial enough extent. Second question in this speech, the practical effects going into the future of this policy. The biggest harm that we bring you, Mr. Speaker, is that this prevents states from acknowledging their own failures that led to the rise of monsters. Our example of colonialism demonstrated that, because it allows colonialism being the bad thing done by states, and for instance, states are able to point to the leaders of apartheid in South Africa and say it was them who were evil. They did terrible things to the people who weren't white in that state. The problem with that is it prevents the people in the UK and America and in Australia and New Zealand and Indonesia from recognising the associated harms with colonialism because they don't blame colonialism, they blame the evil people themselves. But it's a much more complex picture than that, Mr. Speaker. States don't want to explain that colonialism was terrible to the people within it because when they do make that explanation, then people are feel bad about the way their state existed in the past. But they should have to feel that, and they should have to feel that pain because that colonialism was responsible for the pain that was caused. It's important that we can't put blame onto a monster, that we recognise that we were responsible for the creation of the terrible things that occurred. The second thing to look at in this issue is fringe radical movements. They were concerned that they said that the use of the word monster created substantial social costs to coming out as a neo-Nazi. We don't think you need to use the word monster for people to feel like something which is associated with the Holocaust was particularly bad. But even if that was true, we think the problem is that that prevents functional engagement with those people. Because again, as Tom told you, lots of people who are neo-Nazis are terrible. A lot of them were forced to that by poverty. And it's telling that the place in which there are most neo-Nazis is Greece, where there's the most poverty. When you simply call those people monsters, you don't engage with those people, and that means they're less likely to cease to be neo-Nazis in the future, which is a big problem. Even if we accept their characterization, which is that they create a larger social cost, our concern is to being a neo-Nazi. Our concern is that social cost and that condemnation forces people to go underground. That's a problem, because it's harder to protect Jewish people from attacks leveled against them by neo-Nazis when those neo-Nazis are hiding. When we have discourse with those people, we're able to better protect everyone. That's particularly important. The next concern that Tom raised that wasn't responded to was concerns about state interactions. We pointed out that people would be less willing to engage with states like North Korea because when the history curriculum decides to characterize a large number of people as monsters, other people who are in similar positions like Kim Jong-un or Kim Jong-il before him also get treated as monsters. And they then can't understand why their states would engage with those people. That makes it harder to implement good policies like the Sunshine Policy, which causes reunions between families, which are good. Their concern is that victims won't be appropriately represented. We have a couple of responses. Firstly, Tom pointed out that the thing that victims want most is accuracy. They want to understand exactly what happened and exactly what caused a person to behave terribly. Victims will get their catharsis from the condemnation of the Holocaust itself, but they don't need to have an inaccurate picture of the person who committed that in order to get that extent of catharsis. Everyone condemns the Holocaust. That's not questionable. The question is, was the person who committed it pure evil, or was that something else? But secondly, as I pointed out during my first point, this characterization subsumes everyone who supported Hitler as being a neo-Nazi, or as being a Nazi. It's problematic for Jewish people who live in that state then to feel like literally every person who supported the Nazi Party is themselves a monster, because then they feel like they're living within a state of monsters. We think what's actually best for victims is a culture which facilitates rehabilitation, but also which facilitates appropriate relationships and harmony between the different groups in society. We don't get that when we take a simplistic view of what's going on. We think that that will kill the jokes in the public consciousness that the first negative was concerned about. Substantive, nationalistic narratives. We say that states still feel strong connections to the wrongs done to them in the past. That makes it difficult for places like Europe to forget what was done during World War II. Describing people as monsters makes that substantially worse. It's telling, Mr. Speaker, that the biggest Italian newspaper was happy to represent Angela Merkel as giving a Nazi salute because they took a photo from a convenient angle, such that they could make a big deal out of the terribleness of Angela Merkel's economic policy. We think that prevents proper interaction between Germany and Greece, between Italy and Greece, because whenever Italy feels somewhat wronged, they return to the simplistic characterization of a monster. And it was using the strong terms that they wanted to use that prevented current relationships between these states from developing. Those relationships are really important so you can get a functioning Europe and a functioning Euro. That's what we supported, better relationships going forward. So, Mr. Speaker, we could have our cake and eat it too. We could condemn the things done by these actors such that we can make the victims feel the catharsis that they need. But we can also represent the true complexity behind it, which is better for reconciliation. We supported that.
I think the second affirmative for the speech. I'd like to welcome the second speaker of the opposition, James, whose preferred pronoun is he or they.
They might want to have their cake and eat it too, but it's one that they can't have and eat it too in reality. Because the logic we got from that second speaker was apparently when you call colonists monsters, you can't also call colonialism monstrous. That was absurd. They want to say that we can't have our cake and eat it too in this debate. Because we can say that certain people were monsters, but there were also conditions which led towards their monstrous acts being enabled. For example, it is entirely possible, and indeed does occur in most countries around the world, for education systems to say Hitler was a monster. Here is how he got his support to carry out his monstrous acts. We don't see how those things can't occur, and when that was the primary harm set up by the first affirmative speaker, we think they've lost this debate already. I'll talk about two issues of rebuttal, namely how we foster the best possible understanding and therefore prevention of these ideologies being fostered in present-day society, and secondly, I'll talk a bit more about victims. But then I'll move on to a piece of positive material in relation to present and future atrocities and why we're more likely to stop those when we use terms like monster to refer to past leaders. On that first issue of rebuttal, the nature of understanding of these ideologies. These guys, as I indicated in my introduction, wanted to say that the point that, or they basically said, using the word monster is mutually exclusive from an understanding of the conditions that led to their power. But that's clearly not the case. We don't say that Hitler was a monster, therefore everything that led to his rise to power or the popularity he got is irrelevant. We're not going to teach you about any of that. Indeed, we teach more about that as a result of the fact that we consider him a monster. And this goes to the heart of their second line of analysis here, which was the likelihood of further inquiry is undermined by the term monster. I think it is actually increased by the term monster. Why? Because the time that we care probably most about this inquiry is when people are young, and using the term monster is an easy starting point for a lot of people to grapple with. Using extreme terms makes people realize that this person does matter, and then as a result, that their actions matter. At the point that you say this is some complex figure and we don't really know the truth, or there are some very complex and nuanced conditions which led to their rise to power and led to their monstrous acts, it's very hard for people to get excited about learning about that. And as a result, this idea of further inquiry is diminished by their side rather than ours. The next thing they said, that the quality of further and the effectiveness of further education is harmed because people see the truth as incongruous with the concept of a monster. But again, that is not true. The first reason is because often these people simply are monsters. The truth is they are monsters, and most people's instinctive reaction is to agree with that, right? So when we say that Hitler was a monster or Stalin was a monster, and then people go on to learn about the conditions that led to their rise to power, because that was the only nuance that these guys talked about. They never said that Hitler was sort of a good guy or Stalin was sort of a good guy. That's entirely consistent. So that further education people receive is far from incongruous, but indeed accurate, and people thrive on that. The next thing they said was rather bizarre, and this was a bit of a shift, or a bit of new material at second speaker. It was that supporters of Mao should not be marginalised, but we would question what value those supporters have to society. The first thing to say here is that the idea that you shouldn't marginalise them perpetuates, as the second speaker indicated, the idea that perhaps they do have a legitimate case that Mao's actions were justified. So a lot of people, also in the case of Pol Pot in Cambodia, said that yes, it's bad that he's killing and torturing a lot of people, but it's a necessary precondition to get to the utopian communist world that we want. Indeed, a lot of the people that kept the support for the Khmer Rouge in the ensuing years after they were first ousted from power were a bunch of Sweden activists who themselves had gone and visited and came back and said, well, yes, we agree that there are some atrocities going on, but on the whole it's justified because they're moving towards a better world. At the point that you continue to say that maybe they do have some case, maybe we should include them in the dialogue, you strengthen that idea. You first of all make them more likely to think, yes, I am right in this balancing act that I'm creating that James talked about first, but also you make other people more likely to say, well, maybe mainstream society has got that balancing act wrong. Maybe mainstream society didn't realise what quite a utopia we could get in Cambodia if we just killed a few more people. All of that type of dialogue and the enfranchisement of these people is incredibly dangerous, as we told you at first opposition, and they never engaged in. Importantly, we also told you that the social cost of association has increased. Again, not responded to from this side of the House. So at the moment, if you start to consider that perhaps the BNP in the UK or Golden Dawn in Greece might have some good ideas, you're deterred from actually aligning yourself or joining that political party or vocally supporting them in public for the reason that there's such a high social cost from doing so. That means we should ensure that these groups always remain fringe groups. That's why, yes, while Golden Dawn looked to be dangerous for some period of time, they've never actually received real power within Greece because there's a social cost which limits the growth of their support that they can really get in reality. Finally, let's move on to victims and their rights. So these guys said that we need to, what is best for victims is a culture of harmony. But a culture of harmony and inclusion with the people who continue to say that it was just that their people were killed, a culture of harmony with people who have skinheads and call themselves neo-Nazis and have Mein Kampf as their doctrine, that's not harmony for those victims. And importantly, what that speaker never understood was their truth may be very different from ours. So even if they're right, that the reality and the real truth is that these were complex and multi-layered, for the victims, the truth is much more simple than that these people were indeed monsters. And to have society telling them otherwise is incredibly disempowering. We never had a response to the idea that their truth should be the most important one in this debate, because indeed they're the ones who continue to suffer as a result of those crimes committed in the past. Finally, on this silly idea that we're more likely to get reparations if we don't call people monsters. This just relied on the idea that you call the wrong people monsters, right? Because presumably we're more likely to get reparations from colonial states if we call colonists monsters, because we therefore are more likely to recognise that what they did was truly terrible rather than something that potentially could be justified, which is what a lot of quite right-wing people say, that colonialism was something that we had to do because we had to speed up these countries' development. So as a result, we think that idea that was that the first speaker spent quite a bit of time on falls right out of debate. Let me move on to my positive material, that this prevents present and future atrocities from occurring, or more specifically, we're more likely to prevent them ourselves. What do I mean by this? At the point that we condemn past acts with extreme language, like monsters and monstrous acts, we're more likely to say that isn't it terrible that potentially there is someone like that in our world now. So when you walk through the killing fields in Cambodia and you hear people talking about Pol Pot as a monster, you're more likely to say that's something that people really should have acted upon then, versus something which had complex and multi-layered causes which are very hard for any one individual to understand or very hard to nail down. So when we simplify it and say and simplify it in an extremely abhorrent way, we're more likely to feel compelled to go out and act at the moment. So we're more likely, when we've seen those killing fields and we've talked about Pol Pot as a monster, to say, yes, the people who are continuing to kill, to behead citizens among ISIS are also monsters. And as a result, because that is more extreme language, and language at more at a further end of the spectrum of evilness, we're more likely to feel compelled to act and support policies which prevent those people from doing it. We start to ask questions like, how can we allow that monster to get away with it? But also, the chance of further inquiry, as I mentioned earlier, is heightened because at the point that you have an easy to understand concept of a monster at the origin, people inquire more about what that person actually did, and as a result they're more likely to have the knowledge to combat it in the future. Very proud to oppose, Mr. Speaker.
I'd like to thank the second speaker of the negative, and I'd like to welcome the third speaker of the affirmative, James, whose preferred pronoun is he or they.
To prevent humans from doing evil, we needed to understand that humans could do evil. We needed to comprehend that it was human parts of people that caused them to do evil, and not some otherworldly outside thing, something we could not understand and therefore labelled as other, as monster. That's why we needed to not use the label monster. It's so we could understand why people did evil things, that we could prevent them. Otherwise, we have no chance of stopping it in the future. 3 issues. Firstly, why do we need to understand the humanity of evil, and how does a monster label prevent this? Secondly, does it harm victims to not use the label monster? And thirdly, how do we best prevent the future atrocities and evil? Why do we need to understand the humanity of evil? Both teams agree that history teaches us lessons. The question just was then, what was a monster? And it was necessarily a non-human thing. That was the point of the label of monster. It was something that wasn't a person. It was something that couldn't change because it became inherent to that person. That person could never do good because that person had to be, at its core, evil, rather than a person doing terrible things. The problem was that the negative team couldn't, in their minds, separate doing terrible things and the focus on the things that were terrible with just labeling a person this label. And that was harmful for various reasons. So could we look beyond, as we were told, the label of monster? Firstly, we rejected that you should have to look beyond a label to understand the thing. We thought you should focus on understanding it in the first place. But moreover, let's look at the teaching of history. We were told that when you call something a monster, people will inquire more about it. We reject that for a few reasons. Firstly, because if there's an easy answer to an easy question, then you will accept that answer to that question. If our question is, why did Hitler do this? And there's an answer that he is a fundamentally evil person, and we cannot understand why he's evil, but he just was evil, he was a monster, then you don't need to inquire any